Can you tell me a little bit about why you were interested in coming on the podcast?
I thought it was a great idea, the podcast. And, stories is one of the ways people get to know each other. And Steph and I were exchanging stories. And I had mentioned I had this memoir sort of thing that my granddad wrote, which was kind of cool because memories are flawed, of course. And it was in his own handwriting. And I thought it would be a neat thing to share because I thought it was a really unique way to leave a part of yourself. He did have a pretty significant role in my life. And then I looked through some stuff and I was like, oh yeah. And that's a thing I want to get better at too, is remembering those things, I guess. And, realizing those good lessons, because there's a lot there. And somebody who knew you in a unique way and who lived a long time. He lived to 93. Yeah. So Jeff was like, do you want me to retype it? Because it's all handwritten. I was like, oh no, I like handwriting. And then I was like, if I ever have a kid, I'm going to be like, learn about your granddad, type this out, get better at typing and type it for me. I think that would be a good conversation starter / free labor, which is bonus.
We actually call our grandmother Ying, which is the Chinese word for grandmother on the father's side of the family.
I called him Grandpa Foot.
We, in our native language, in Hindi, we call them Dada and Dadi.
My other grandmother would be Maman Bozorg, which is Persian for grandmother.
Muchechu means old woman in Kinyarwanda.
I called her Safta, which is a Hebrew word for grandma.
Everybody called her Mamitita.
We called her Mima and Dede.
Grandma.
Hi, I'm Steph.
And I'm Robin. Welcome to Stories from Grandparents,
the podcast where we share stories about and from grandparents.
On today's episode, you'll hear our friend Jenna, who is recounting a story read in large part from her grandfather's memoirs.
About this one crazy story of when he ran away from home, joined the Merchant Marines, traveled a bunch of different places. And a crazy adventure is basically what the word we should use.
We hope you enjoy.
All right, so my name is Jenna Drummond-Young. And my grandfather's name, that's who I'm going to talk about today. Not that all the other ones weren't great. You were. And his name was Gaetano Salvatore Amatruda. That was his given name at birth. And then his name he took on when he came to Canada was Daniel Amatruda. A little bit, I guess, easier to say and a little less Italian. He was born in 1920, which was a million years ago by now. And he was born in Pontone, which is above the Amalfi Coast in Italy. He was a fun, charming man. He was very charming. He used to sing a lot. He'd sing when he'd wash the dishes. He would sing when we went on walks. One of my most favorite stories about him, or a story, I guess, about him and I, was we used to play chess together. And when he, being Italian, he was in England, and then he was interned in Canada during the Second World War. So he played a lot of chess. And in the camp, I suppose they had some time on their hands. And so they did that a lot, and he got quite good at it. I think he, boasted about being one of the best in the camp, or maybe even the best. I'd visit him in Kitchener-Waterloo, where he came to stay when he came to Canada for that time, and we'd play. We would play on the front porch with it was concrete, and it had those like Italian sculptures with the ladies without any arms and breasts and sometimes no head, and like all kinds of that stuff about under a grapevine with grapes that would sometimes be on it depending on the time of the summer. And we would play and we played and we played, and I'd lose and I'd lose and I'd lose. And then I even played on my computer at home to try to get better. And then one time I was over, we were playing with this sets like marble, and it was hand carved, and everything was hand carved and unique and giant, like a fist. Like every piece was a fist. And I had trouble sometimes telling them apart. And I'd often think that I would have won had I known better or seen the difference. And then sometimes I felt like he was tricking me. But anyhow, there's one time, and witnessed by my cousin, I won my first time against him at chess. And I was like, I was saying to Robin, I was like, that's the day I became a woman. And I was just like, yes, I felt because I had that specialness to it because he never let me win. I had to earn it, right? And it was sort of confirming for me and confidence building, I suppose, that I was able to beat him at something he was so good at and I could become good at too. So that was cool. And after that, I lost a whole bunch again, I think for a good deal of time. He had to sharpen his skills. I had totally forgotten. You know, some things they're in your brain and some things are more available for recall. And then some things you pull out and you're like, oh, I forgot about that. And you have fun remembering it all. And you're lucky to have, again, for the second time or whatever, recall it. And it was definitely one of those memories because I had forgotten. And then I'm reminded, if I am appreciative of what he did in writing down some of his stuff, should I not in turn, not only for myself, but for others, write down little segments like that. I'm probably not as good a writer, storyteller as he was. But it's, I think in small chunks, it's something I could bite off.
Yeah. And it's a really beautiful gift that you have from him is this like memoir. And I was saying, like, it's not written like a diary.
No.
It's very much like a story with suspense and like build up. And
wow.
It's really beautiful. And how Jenna described it really beautifully. It's not his whole life, but it's what he chose to capture for his family. You know, it was like a piece of him that maybe they weren't necessarily a part of these adventures and just, perhaps his most defining moments as a person.
His legacy.
Yeah.
And it makes you think, like, what will that be? What will I write for my children or grandchildren? And like, I have no idea. But it's a very nice thing you have from him to remember him by.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you could tell us a bit about what is in the memoir. Like, what are your favorite?
It was an adventure he's recalling from when he was a boy. So, and I guess this is his story and it's his coming to age story. He sort of left home a boy and became a man through this adventure. And I think manhood and those sorts of things are really important to him. And one of those things that he wanted to, I guess, capture is how he came to be who he was.
And there's a title, right? It's called Kicked into a Long Journey.
Yeah. Well, it's literal for so in 1936 in September, his parents, so he's Italian born and this and that, but they moved to Dundee and they had I think a restaurant there. And
Dundee, Scotland?
Yes, Dundee, Scotland. And his parents left, and as was a custom for Italians, the eldest boy took charge of the home. And he was in control. And so it was George and Victor and Dan, and short for Daniel. And he was 16. So the eldest son just took full charge and like told everyone what to do and was a typical older brother in control. Like, was like, everybody has to do what I say. I don't have to do any chores of any kind. And it's all you. And that's my job. And I guess, so this is sort of links into the title and maybe I'll read it. But so far in the story up to this point, it's just essentially him venting that him and his younger brother were having a tough time with him and we're getting sick of his, ridiculousness as his parents were away. And he writes that, this led to lots of shouting and frequent punches. I, being of a nature of a rebel more, came under attack even when we had to go to bed. Since I shared one with George is the older brother. Of course, George's excuse to be physical did not require too much reason, and the justification this night was, as always, that I had taken too much of the covers, so he pulled them half off my body. I, annoyed, pulled them back. The response from my brother was to kick me so hard that I landed on the floor. To that action, I started dressing and vowed to leave the house. Where to? I had no idea. But fuming and determined, I kept dressing whilst Victor sought to appease me, that's his younger brother, and urged me not to leave, also calling the eldest a bully. But the big brother was unmoved, saying only, "Don't worry, he'll be back in the morning for his porridge." I left the house. I was glad to get away from such a callous person and treatment. So this is in 1936, and this is, I don't have siblings, but this is a sticking it to his older brother, I'm going to show you moment. And he left and didn't come back until 1939. So, and he was 16. So as you can imagine, his parents came home and were like, "Where is your brother?"
Yeah.
And he was like, I kicked him and he left and I didn't pursue him. And now he's really gone." So that sort of tipped it off. So he was kicked into this long journey.
Kicked off the bed
And into life. So he talks sort of about starting off his journey, and it was like in the middle of the night, and he walked into town in Dundee, and all the shops were closed and everything was eerie and weird. And so he gets into Dundee and he puts his thumb up, just like in the movies, or that he's seen in the movies. And just like in the movies, it worked. So this guy pulled over and asked my granddad where he was headed to. And he had no idea, but wanted to like keep it together and was like, just down the road or whatever. And then he got the smarts to ask him where he was going. And the driver said, Glasgow. So he said, "I'm going to Glasgow too." And so the guy didn't press. He sort of, I guess, figured it out. So he got all the way to Glasgow. And he got out there and he was visiting the shipyards, and he found out that he could get a job there and he needed a union pass. So he had his, a little bit of savings, pulled it out of the bank and went and got a sailor union membership. And he boarded a ship in Glasgow, and they crossed the Irish Sea, and it was horrible. And his job there was even more horrible because he was a cabin boy and he worked 16 hours a day cleaning and cooking and doing all the lower level tasks that nobody probably wants to do, and being 16 and away from home and all of this. So then they arrive in Liverpool, and they are there to pick up steel, and the destination is South America, and it's going to take 6 to 7 weeks if the weather is good. He wasn't exactly expecting to go there. He wanted to go to the US, but he was like, "Okay, all right, sure. All right. I've always thought about adventure. This is my chance. And why not?" He stayed on, and he loaded the steel, and he continued his duties. And he talks about seeing, dolphins at sea and whales. And he was responsible for throwing out the extra food from the day. And he threw it in the back. And sometimes they would see sharks. And he also learned in going through the ocean as he did that there are these flying fish, and they're attracted to lights. So he had the bright idea one night, because they had run out of regular food, like the fresher food, I guess, and it had gotten to a monotonous type diet. So he put lanterns all over the ship, and in the morning he went around collecting all these fish. So he prepared all these flying fish for everybody.
Wow, that sounds like a fairy tale.
Right?
Like, really?
I know. I know. So we'd have to find the cook to verify that for sure.
It's so beautiful though. Like the imagery of it is incredible.
So they flew onto the deck of the ship?
Yeah, I guess. I don't think it was that. I think it was big, but I don't think it was that fancy of a ship. It's not like the biggest ship in the world kind of thing. No, it was not the Titanic. And
it's so cool.
It is cool, and
I've seen flying fish on planet Earth, and they are cool.
Yes,
they're cool. They're the best of both worlds.
Mm-hmm. Here's the segment. Yeah, I could read it.
Oh yeah, please do.
So, flying fish, because they really glide for 200 to 300 yards after a tremendous sputter out of the water. These fish have long fins on each side of their body that, when extended, are similar to wings. The cook told me these fish often land on the deck of a boat at night, attracted by the light. So a bell rang in my head, and that night, with the help of the cook who got me the lanterns, we hung this on guardrails and went to bed. The next morning, I collected about 20 of these fish. Our diet on the boat, after using up all the fresh food, became monotonous. So fresh fish was something special. But the cook, not knowing how to prepare the fish, left the job up to me. They tasted wonderful. The only regret was that one did not run into schools of flying fish often. So yeah, that was cool. So he had those kinds of experiences in the open ocean, and he also remarks in a beautiful passage I'm sure I can't find how tremendous and vast it is, and how sort of small he came to feel being out on the ocean for so many weeks. Let's see what he says. Oh, right before this, he talks about he went on a strike on the ship because he noticed that all the sailors were working fewer hours than him, working 16. So he had like a sit-in, and eventually he was brought to the captain's office, and the captain was told he was just refusing to work. And then he told the captain he was refusing to work based on this principle. So he was victorious, and the captain reduced his working hours and to I think 12 hours a day. So still brutal, but big improvement. And he also got a lunchtime thing. So right before he talks about the ocean, he's like, "This was a victory that brought me respect from the rest of the crew who until then barely noticed me. Life aboard became more tolerable, allowing me more freedom to take in my surroundings and the ocean, which for me held a hypnotic attraction. The ocean, was a powerful living force that commanded respect, yet offered so much interest. The dolphins, friendly boat companions, exuded a love of life with their antics while swimming easily alongside. Seagulls who noisily followed the boat for 500 miles and suddenly disappear. Of course, I cursed them too. When I'd be carrying plates of food for the officers' dining room, these birds would swoop down and, without stopping, steal something off the plate. Cheeky rascals. The reason the gulls could do this was because the kitchen was reachable only by going out into the open deck. Whales, too, were not an uncommon sight. One of my duties was to empty a large bucket of leftover food daily. As soon as I did this, food hit the water. Shark fins from all over arrived to claim their share. They eventually got to South America, and they got to Uruguay, and they went into Argentina. The language there being Spanish and his being Italian, he was able to sort of get by and chat with people. And he went to Buenos Aires, and he boxed and lost. He bragged that he could box, and then they set him up with a local who was actually a boxer. And so for losing, he got, I guess, a couple pesos, but the winner definitely got more and got there pretty quickly, I think. He talks about trying to ask for directions in Buenos Aires to some women, and he was, stopped by the police and little things of the day that sort of remind you of the era. He was also brought to a brothel there. It's interesting, he's talking to one prostitute who is knitting there, and he was like, oh, she's not like the other girls. And he was talking to her, and I guess it was her night off or something. She was saying that he was like, oh, so why are you here? Why is this a life that, you're leading? And she said, she came from a poor family and she was of marriageable age, but her family didn't have enough of a dowry for her to become married, and that she was working there in hopes that she would be able to stop in a couple years. And it was a very matter-of-fact sort of conversation. I thought that was really interesting. And then, some funny, it being a brothel and him being 16 also brought around some humor. So there's a little part here that I'll read, which I think is kind of funny. He says, towards the end of our meal, one of the girls asked the cook to come upstairs. The cook in turn asked, I go as well. Hesitating, my excuse was that I had no money to pay the girls. He said he'd loan the money to me. Do you want to remain a virgin all your life? The girls understood none of the conversation except the word virgin, which is similar to virgin, I guess, in Spanish, which means the same. The uproars from the girls sent the message across the whole restaurant and had them all clapping and turning their heads towards our table. I was very embarrassed at being such a spectacle, while the cook was enjoying the whole thing. Determined not to be forced into something I was uncomfortable with, I refused, but my refusal was not accepted by the girls, who in turn offered to take me upstairs at no cost, with it seemed the encouragement of all the patrons in the restaurant. Finally, the right answer came to me. I promised I would come back the next day with my own money to pay for the service. The cook went up, did his exercise, and we left.
Imagine he wrote
And then he went upstairs.
But he's like, but my granddaughter's going to read it.
Yeah.
We'll never truly know, right? But I admire his restraint, if that's true.
Yeah, but even there's like, he talks about marijuana cigarettes, and he talks about stealing, and he talks about being a stowaway and going to jail. And I don't think... I don't know that he would have kept that. He probably would have been like, oh, yeah. Mm-hmm. And then at a brothel, free.
That's another level.
It is another level. It's true.
He wrote a really nice passage after that.
Yeah. He was sort of, I think he wanted to be clear to the reader. Mm-hmm. And he goes on to say, to clear a point, let me better explain my reluctance to do what any healthy, husky lad would have done with gusto. That is, a couple with a nice girl. The scene was not an encouraging one for a first-timer. Plus, fear of sex diseases had taught me caution.
Sex diseases.
And I was like, you know what? Good point. That's exercising some sex ed in 1936. Not bad. So then, after this sort of incident, they were packing up the ship, and they were getting ready to go to Halifax, Nova Scotia. So that was next on the list. But in that time, they also went through the Amazon River, and then he had to stop in Haiti to get refueled for the ship. And they couldn't board or they couldn't land in Haiti because the water, I guess, is so shallow where they were seeking to go. So they had to have a thing come out and fill their ship. So I guess this all takes time. And he had a couple of interesting little adventures there. He trades his T-shirt. So there's all these people coming up to the boat vendors and stuff. And it's like this interesting, in a way, it's a purchase, but it's also like this cultural exchange because he says, okay, I'll give you my shirt, the guy, to signal to him. And so he takes off his shirt and sends it down. And then the Haitian guy, sends back up a bunch of things like mangoes and bananas and coconut carving and a seashell box that he gave to his sister later in the journey, and he still had it. It was interesting because he's like very curious. He's like, oh, my shirt must have been very, prized because I got this huge basket of like goods. And is also just such a different sort of time. And he reports on it so blatantly, and in recalling, he says, one of these rowboats heading straight for us contained a man rowing and a young, lightly dressed Haitian girl with a sun umbrella, bobbing about not 20 feet away. The young lady, who noticed the captain, looked up and yelled, "Do you want to fuck, Captain?" Right here, written. To her second query, the captain turned and walked away. It is customary when a ship cannot dock that the business girls, in quotes, come to the customers. The customers, that is, the rest of the crew in the rear port of the ship, let down rope ladders so that the girls can come aboard to do what they do best in men's sleeping quarters. A practice that the captain turns a blind eye to. Myself, I got tempted by a boat with a vendor of fruit who is pointing to my T-shirt and then to the fruit, and I dropped my T-shirt, wondering what I would get in exchange. It seemed to have great value at that time because in the exchange sent up a bushel basket which had a coconut, and et cetera, and it goes on and on. And he says, my sister still has this seashell box.
It's so, I'm imagining the story, I guess, from even my own perspective, and for in the 30s, where there's not even media that shows what a palm tree is, what a white sand beach and turquoise, the fact that this is his, these are his defining memories are so understandable because it's shocking. Think about culture shock. You've hardly seen anything when people back then, you see within a few 100 miles maybe of where you're born in your entire life, and that's it, and you're lived to be 50, right? And for sure. And then he goes and sees these vastly other worlds and different cultures and different everything. That would be so incredible. I mean, it's incredible today when it happens to people. It's a miracle, but wow, back then the visualization I have for it is stepping someone in a black and white movie, stepping out of the screen.
So then in Haiti, after they got refueled, they left and they started the way to Halifax. And he wanted to go to the U.S. So Halifax, in his mind, seemed pretty close to that. And the thing that they do is they hold your wages on the ship so that when you deport or whatever, you're not just like running off and they have no crew. So they hold your wages there so you can go, but you know, you'd be losing something if you left. And in this instance, they had 3 months' wages. So, which was a big deal. And he got about $3 because they landed in Halifax on January 1st, 1937. And he says that by today's buying power standards, it was about $30 to $35. And it was snowing. And, you know, he didn't have the proper stuff with him for snow, of course. And he just decided that, so he was done with that. He was going to start trying to get to the United States. So he went to the train yards and asked a bum, as he phrases it, but defends the bum by saying, you know, it was 1937 and people were still reeling from the Great Depression. And so he, in this way, I guess it would have been odd now. I think there's such a social distance to those people that are, you know, on the streets or whatnot than it was back then, because it happened to so many that perhaps there was a different relationship with the poor because it was a common thing. So he spoke to the guy and he's like, what's your advice? And he said, you know, just don't be seen. And he recounts the brutality that was taken upon those folks if they were caught. So there was no concern for them. They had,
you mean who were caught on the train?
Yeah. So sometimes they would shoot them or just beat them or throw them off the moving train. So it was there was a real deterrent to not getting caught. So he went and the first train didn't go so far. And insofar as he was seen and he had to jump off the moving train, and then he stopped and he was like, okay, I'll go back and then I'll retry another time. And he went to board again and he was discovered again, but the man took pity on him and didn't report him, and took him home to his house and gave him a meal, which he hadn't had in a long time, in addition to a wool coat and boots and a toque and all of these other things that he had no way of accessing. And he talks about being so grateful to this person, somebody he'll never forget, for his kindness. And then he took him back to the train and sort of helped him like stow away for a while. And then he got...
So really, he lost his 3 months' wages to go on this journey.
Yeah,
like
he did.
$5.
Yeah. He was like, that's, see ya.
He was a stowaway.
Yeah. And so he didn't have too much purchasing power. And he got caught. And then they threw him in jail. And then with this other Italian guy who had TB and kept spitting blood. So he was...
TB, like tuberculosis?
Like tuberculosis.
Okay.
Yeah. And he was spitting, and I was like, wow, Grandpa, I'm glad you didn't get tuberculosis, because then I wouldn't be here.
It's highly likely.
Yeah. Like dirty quarters, close quarters.
Spitting blood.
Yeah. So he was there for 2 weeks, and he was in jail. Then he was complaining about this guy. Like, it's so funny. My grandpa, you can see I'm complaining. I'm 16 years old. I'm going to go stand up to these sailors and say, I'm going on a protest because this isn't fair. And then being in jail, the audacity of him being like, I am in jail, but I am making a complaint about my roommate here. Like, he is spitting blood and I want out. And I'm just like, at 16, I'm like, in a foreign country.
You know.
That's impressive.
You know what? He must have been really well liked.
Like,
how do you get away with it? Like, he must have, like, you described him as charming at the beginning of the interview. Like, that must have been what it was. Like,
he
must have, like, he was young and he must have been really well liked for people to tolerate that.
They took pity on him, you know? And he says that because he was like, when he got arrested, he told them his name was, it's right here. That's pretty lucky. It said, the officer arrived after a few hours and took me in handcuffs to his office, a little distance away on foot. Halfway to the office, the officer started questioning me for my identity. Anticipating all these questions and not wanting to be sent back to Scotland, I gave a false name, James London. and said I was an orphan. To complete my cover, I had also taken off all the labels on my clothing. The officer noticed this while on the road to his office. I guess they would check it, be like, maybe it would say something about Scotland, or you could tell, I don't know. He then checked my pocket, and I had a handkerchief and a coin purse, which the officer took. Looking inside were some coins and a small piece of paper with my real name and address, for which, for the moment, I had forgotten about. Just as the officer was about to open the piece of paper, I snatched it out of his hand and put it in my mouth to chew and swallow. This piece of paper was my insurance. If I were to die, that my parents would be notified, but not in the present circumstances. The officer, taken by surprise and unsure what to do, took out his revolver, raising it to hit me on the head when he hesitated. Maybe because I was a youngster. I don't know. He didn't. So he sort of talks about that, and then his punishment, I guess, because he was being so loud and obnoxious in there, was that he had to do a year's worth of labor. So they sent him to a farmer.
This is in Quebec still?
Yeah, in Quebec, to work for him. And the deal was you didn't get paid whatever low wages you get until you learn the skill. So he worked for free for several months, working, waking up at 4 a.m. and this and that. And he talks about how the farmer would complain because he ate too much. And so he would eat the carrots that were for like the farm animals and the oats and things like this, and just in order to like feed himself, because he's 16 years old, he's working hard, he's probably growing a lot. So he did that, and he took it for quite a good amount of time. He eventually left on foot for the U.S. once the weather got a little bit better. So he ran away from this deal. He didn't complete the deal of being there for a year. The guy was awful by the sounds of it, and made a bit of a slave out of him. And it's interesting, actually, when he was there, I recall a passage where he wrote a letter to his family. He was like, oh, I should write a letter because they're going to be, they're stressed out. I think he wrote one previously, too, when they were about to go to Argentina. And but in this one, he didn't have any wages and they didn't have any paper. So he actually took birch bark and wrote on the birch bark to home, and then he took some more birch bark and he sewed it all together to make an envelope, and then he sent it. And he finds out later that it was actually received and in good shape, and his sister still had it and kept it in a box because it had sort of disintegrated, I guess, over time. But I thought that was, that's so the time, the 1920s. Okay, well, no paper, I'll just go get birch bark, I'll sew myself an envelope, and I'm gonna send it home, no big deal.
Have you ever seen that?
Very resourceful.
No, I haven't. It's kind of also neat that I don't know his sister, but that there was that seashell box, and that, in my made up sort of me filling in the blanks the way I like would be that birch bark letter would be in that seashell box, and that would be pretty cool. A seashell box from Haiti.
That's exactly what I was thinking too.
Yeah,
I
weird.
Just became familiar with this story.
Yeah,
maybe she keeps it in that.
Yeah, but it would be cool because it's like it would be like a neat thing to see from that journey, out of time, right? And it's very interesting. Like, he definitely says some things of that time about women and about other people, but he's also super open. Like, for an Italian guy, European, first time going, like, he's talking to the Argentinians, he gets reprimanded for doing so, but he can kind of speak Spanish because he can speak Italian. So he's going over to their houses for dinner, and people are like, you're going to get killed. And he's like, whatever. He recounts these things in a very, I don't know, I guess modern way. Yeah. And I guess because he was so young, maybe he didn't have all the formative, like, you're supposed to hate this person and that person, because all of a sudden that was never going to come up in his life, probably, someone of a different color, or at least not for a while. And then all of a sudden there was, he was like, okay, you're a person. Mm-hmm. I wasn't, raised to hate you or whatever. So I think that's cool. Not to say that he was perfect in that regard, but, he gets hitchhiking again. He was successful. And the trucker says, I'm going to New York, but you can only come with me if you're going to New York. He says, yeah, I'm going to New York. He wasn't. He was going to Philly. He wanted to go to Philly. And
why Philly?
He knew he had a relation there, as he calls him. His uncle was there. And so he wanted to visit him in the great USA, where he also at that time remarks about how his cousins taught him about marijuana cigarettes, and they took him to see a dealer, and they were being sold for 25 cents. And he's like, I've heard of these, but I had never once known someone who sold them or used it. And I was like, oh, yeah, cool.
And this is in the 40s?
It would have been like 37, 38.
That's so early. I don't really picture marijuana like coming on the scene as a norm until the 60s.
Yeah. No, it was there. Maybe it was more illicit back then, or maybe it was less. I don't know. But so he gets to New York, and the trucker's like, New Yorkers don't give drives to strangers. He's like, I'll drop you at the bus stop. You have to get a bus pass. Like, no one's going to pick you up here. Mm-hmm. So he goes to Philly, and he gets there and he gets off the bus, and he's just a bit naive. And he's like, my uncle owns a ice cream store, and his name is Dan Amatruda also. I don't know. They all shared these names, I guess. Mm-hmm. And it just so happens that this random stranger he asked was like, oh, are you his nephew? And then he's like, yes, I'm his nephew. And it was just a sweet moment, because I think he was a religious man, and he talks about like a guardian angel or something, or, he talks about them in a couple places, holding on to the train. And then also in this moment that he was able to find this just so easily without any, not having to ask more than even one person, and able to find him. And then he was brought there, and they had a long embrace, and he caught up with everybody, and they showed him the marijuana cigarettes. And
he has some luck though, eh? Like,
oh, big time. So he stayed in Philly for a time with these guys, his family, and after a while he felt like he couldn't really support himself because it was still a tough job market out there, and he left. He was like, okay, I don't want to be that guy in the family, and he went to Atlantic City to work, and what he found there was working at a club, and it was a really nice club. He says it held like 1,300 people. He seemed to connect patrons with girls. I don't know if girls means prostitutes, but yes, like a pimp. I'm not sure if that was it, but he was definitely connecting singles with ladies and attending to the customers' needs. And he says that he liked this job for the reason that he didn't really have a boss other than the customers. They were like, get me a cigarette, get me a drink, get me this. And he was just to attend to all their needs. And he did so. And he talks about the great music, and he says, with the great music everywhere, I was always floating around to such famous bands as Glenn Miller, Tommy Dorsey, Harry James, and Benny Goodman. Few people remember them today, but in those years they ruled and moved everyone to their beat. So it kind of puts an image. And then he talks about one of the girls' names being Bunny, and like very classic, club scene, people selling cigarettes on those little, trays.
I love that.
So that was the time he was living in. He got to enjoy all of that at the ripe age of being a teen. And the club closed down, and the other jobs closed down, and he didn't have a job, didn't really have family there, and there was a threat of war coming, so he decided he was going to head home. Not having any money again, he needs to find a way back. So he figures out that you can buy this pass to go aboard ships to say farewell to the person who's boarding. And there's a small cost, but it's not as much as the ticket itself. A lot of people tried to do this at the time. So what he did, that he thought he was a bit smarter, or no, I think it was actually by mistake. I'd have to check the text again. But he bought a first class ticket by mistake. A first class saying goodbye to his family ticket, which I guess gave him cover insofar as who would buy a first class thing if you're just trying to be stowed away and blah, blah, blah. So he got on, or he went there, and it was to some protest. The guy was like, well, where are the other people? You have to board with them. Like where? And he was like, oh, they're already on board, and oh, they're going to just, be so mad if I don't go in and say goodbye and blah, blah, blah. And the guy was finally like, fine, go. And so his plan then was to find a hiding spot and not come out. the ship was called the Queen Mary, and it was known for being stowaway proof. They had lights in all the safety boats. They had all of this stuff to protect for this purpose. And he found a hole or like a vent in the bathroom. So when everyone left, and I guess they did some accounting for people during the day or whatever, he would come out sometimes, but he stayed in this vent. And he describes the vent as being pretty, other than the first day, it was pretty clean. So he was able to stay clean. And I guess as a stowaway, that's something you worry about when you come out. So people aren't like, you're a stowaway because you're dirty, like a vent. So he also made himself a little nest because he couldn't really like sleep in there because it was constant air coming in. So he shoved a bunch of newspaper in the back of it. And he had no money, so he had this chocolate that he had purchased. And the voyage was about 4 days long across the Atlantic. And he stayed in this little thing popping out every so often, cleaning himself. He talks about how, so this is about 1939. He was like, he still didn't need to shave. He's like, it was good I didn't need to shave because I wouldn't have had a way to shave and it would have given me away. And he's like, I didn't grow hair on my face until I was 20. So I was like, oh, good to know. And then, so they get all the way to the other side, I guess somewhere in England or whatever. And he thinks it's the final destination. So he sort of like gets out and then somebody sees him with his feet popping back in and they get him in trouble, which I think sucks. Like if the guy made it all the way over, just let him finish his journey. But they didn't, and they told on him. And then he got like arrested. And because he hadn't eaten in 4 days, he fainted when they arrested him. And they figured out who he was. I guess he told them or whatnot. I don't recall that specific part, but his parents ended up having to pay his fare, which was 20 pounds or something like this, in order for him to be released. Because once again, he was jailed. And so he stayed with his sisters and then eventually went back to see his parents for the first time in a really long time. And he has it made the national news, as he said, because of the ship being one of the, stowaway proofest. And he was the first stowaway to make it all the way across the Atlantic in the ship undetected. Wow. In one of the articles, it says it's like the Dundee Telegraph of March 30th, 1939. And he says he had apparently been without food for most of the trip, which lasted 4.5 days. The young stowaway came out of the hiding place at, I guess it's Scarborough, thinking that the ship had reached Southampton. He was detained until the liner arrived at Southampton, questioned by immigration officials, handed over to police, and detained for the night at Southampton Police Headquarters. And they interview his parents in this, and he says, Miss Amatruda told reporters that Daniel always talked about longing an adventurous life. He told that someday he would go to America to become a millionaire. And there's a note here, my grandfather underlines it, and he said, made up by reporter. So he didn't apparently want to become a millionaire. It's interesting because
that's the part he wants to see as a lie.
I just that is not true. And there's some neat parts in there where they talk about, every so often they would get a letter from him and then they would, for months at a time, hear nothing at all from him. It's kind of neat the way he leaves off the last, I guess, paragraph of his story that he puts together. He says, I was unconditionally released from prison after payment was received. That was payment for the ticket. Picked up by my sister Maria and her boyfriend, then taken first to her apartment in London, then on to Dundee. Meanwhile, a decision to allow me to remain in Britain was only given after several weeks. Arriving home was a moving experience, with many questions to answer and eagerly absorbed by my brother and friend Victor. However, the increasing threat of war in the background between Italy and Britain cast an uneasy and ominous future for all. So it's kind of neat. It ends at that 1939. Wow. And sort of that anticipation.
So do you know what happened after? Did he have to fight in the war?
No, he was Italian, and he had a shop in in England somewhere, or Scotland. I think it was England though by that point. No, it was England because that's where my mother was born later. But anyway, Italy was the bad guy for England, and then Canada was an ally. So he was interned during the war in Quebec. So he was taken from his shop with his brother and taken to Canada against his will, and he was put in a camp there for the duration of the war.
Holy fuck.
Yeah. And he, that's where, when he was interned is where he did the chess. And he also studied mathematics, and his brother there taught Italian to different people, and he sort of had that whole life. I know one of your questions is about what he taught. And I was actually I was like, okay, I'm sure he taught me something. So I was trying to think it through. And one of the things that bleeds well from the story that I just sort of recounted, albeit roughly, is I took myself way too seriously as like a teenager and young adult. I was just like, everything is ultimately important. I laugh at it now, but at the time I thought it was a completely appropriate level of seriousness to take life with. And in this letter to me, February 28th, 2009, at the end of it, it's funny, I don't know what I wrote to him at it, but I can imagine. But it says, "By the way, you say all this dreaming as if it were not important, but it is for dreaming that I visited a large part of the world. So dream, Jenna. With much affection, Grandpa Amatruda."
Very good.
Sounds awesome.
Excellent. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me on this beautiful day.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you for listening to Stories from Grandparents. If you have any interest in submitting stories, or if you want to participate on the podcast, please send us an email at storiesfromgrandparentspodcast@gmail.com.